Thank you for joining me today as we begin a new study. We're calling it Words with Friends. We're going to be talking about what we say, the things we say, the things we should say, the things we should not say, and probably some filters that need to be in place. Nothing affects our lives as much as the things we say. Likely not our actions nor our thoughts. Our words impact our lives more than anything else that we do. Our lesson tonight is entitled The Rules. We're going to begin this study, Words with Friends, by simply looking at several passages of Scripture that should guide our discussion over the next few weeks. So we'll be referring to some of these again as we move forward. Let me begin in a passage, it's 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 10 and 11. Also, it comes from the Old Testament. Peter writes it this way, "For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it." Now, this is not obviously all about our tongue. It's about seeking peace, looking for good, turning away from evil. It's quite a good model for life. But notice the import in the beginning of that statement. If you desire to see life and good days, then refrain your tongue from evil and refrain your lips from speaking deceit. Now, if we're thinking about probably the broadest passage in all of the New Testament in reference to our topic of words, most of our thoughts would go pretty quickly to James chapter 3. So let's go there as we get started today. We're going to read the first 12 verses, and then we're going to pick out a few particular things to enlarge upon just a little bit. James writes, chapter 3, verse 1. "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. If we put bits into the horses' mouths so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ship also. Though they are so large, they are driven by strong winds. They are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird and reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessings and cursings. He says, my brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth at the same opening both fresh water and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. Now, there's a few things along in this reading that hint at and fairly explicitly state the great power of the tongue. He begins in verse 2 by saying, if anyone does not stumble in reference to the tongue, if anyone does not fail in reference to what he says he's a perfect man. In other words, this is the most difficult thing to accomplish. You notice a little bit further down as we look through the text. In verse 5, so also the tongue is a small member, but boasts great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire. We all are very much aware, and hence the reason we look at this topic. We're all very much aware of how just a few words can change the direction of life. It can change relationships. It can irrevocably harm relationships with just a few words. Our words are extremely powerful. Verse 6, the tongue is a fire. Well, that says it all just pretty much by itself. Also, you might notice with me, verse 8, sort of the conclusion of this argument that he builds. He says, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. We might look at that, we might read that and say, well, why should it matter what we do? We're not going to win. We're not going to do this well. But that's not the approach the Bible takes to any topic, much less the words that we say. Because we're given guidelines, how that we ought to guide our words, and a little insight as to where those words really come from. So let's move on and look at a couple of other passages. I'm sure we'll come back to this one at some point in the near future. Go with me to Philippians chapter 4. In Philippians chapter 4, you might not even think about this one in reference to our words, because it's not our speech that is particularly mentioned here. But yet I think you'll agree with me that it's very important to the topic that we're beginning today. We know the passage. Verses 8 and 9 out of Philippians chapter 4, it says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Now, the rest of that paragraph, and it's just a 2-verse paragraph, verse 9, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Very simple guidelines. But you might say, but these are guidelines for our thoughts. And that is exactly what he says here. Whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable. He says, think on these things. You know, through our lives in different areas, we're encouraged to think positive thoughts. You know, if there's something bothering us, then let's try to think about other things. Someone says, don't go to sleep at night worried about the things of the day. Find some way to think of better things and you'll rest better. You know, we have all sorts of ideas along those lines. But the Bible's message here is, let's concentrate our minds. Let's ponder, let's think on the things that are worthy, on the things that are valuable, the things that are good. Now, what effect then, we might ask, obviously, does this have on our words? Well, I think we know it has quite an effect on our words. You're probably already thinking of the next passage that we're going to go to. And it's one of probably the 3 major passages that deal very specifically with the words that we say. Now, there's several passages along this line. I'm going to look and take our minds to Luke chapter 6 and verse 45. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 45, we find I would say, the most compact version of this statement. You can also find a very similar statement in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 34, and very closely to it, Matthew chapter 15, verses 18 and 19. So you might go there and consider what those two passages add to this part of the discussion. But I want to keep us in Luke chapter 6 and verse 45. Now, to begin the context, let's back up just a couple of verses to verse 43. The entire paragraph, these 3 verses. He says, "For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from bramble bush." Then verse 45, "The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good. The evil person out of the evil treasures produces evil." And here's the statement: "For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." Now, we know that simple truth to be true. A good person, a person who has a good heart, produces good things. And an evil person, you don't look at someone who you consider to be a very evil person and say, here is the only problem they have. Boy, and everything else, they're just good people. They do a great job over here, but wow, they're terrible over here. No, for the most part, one who is evil in all ways. One who will cheat you in one place will cheat you in a second and a third place, given the opportunity. We understand that a person that's good produces good. A person that's evil produces bad. But the insight here, he says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The key here is that you can't start with your words. You don't start with your words. We start with what motivated those words. We start with where did those words come from. You know, we even say that sometimes, don't we? We'll say something out loud and then we'll say, I don't know where that came from. I do. We say, I don't know where those words came from. They came from your heart. That's where they came from. Now, you might argue that, well, that didn't truly represent my heart. It just represented the emotions of the moment. Maybe so, but that's not too far away. You see, the point is, we have to start with the heart. That's why we just read a few moments ago, Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9. Whatever things are true, honest, just, good, think on those things. Because whatever is simmering in your heart is what is going to come out in your words. Those people who know me well know that one of my favorite illustrations, and I use it often and pretty much unapologetically, because it speaks an obvious truth that everyone sees very quickly. And that is simply that you don't wait until you're standing in Dairy Queen, looking up at the menu, looking at the selection of all the different versions that you can have a blizzard made in, and then think to yourself, I don't need to have ice cream. You see, the point is, it's too late. You're standing at the DQ looking up at the menu. I can't tell you everything about yourself at this point, but I can tell you one thing for sure. You are about to have ice cream. Now, if you really didn't want to have ice cream, then you shouldn't have gotten out of the car at the Dairy Queen. No, if you didn't want to have ice cream, if you weren't going to have ice cream, you shouldn't have left the house thinking you were going to go get ice cream. I don't know where, you went awry. I don't know where you made a wrong turn. I don't know necessarily where you could have stopped or not stopped. But one thing I can tell you is that if you're standing in the DQ, looking up at the menu, looking at the options, you're about to have ice cream. You see, you can't say, well, I'm going to try to catch that word before it comes out. Oh, occasionally you can, but you have to start a long time back from there. You have to start with your heart. What you allow to simmer in your heart, what you allow to stay on your mind, what you allow to roll over and over again in your mind, because whatever is heavy on your heart is going to come out of your mouth. That's just about that simple. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Finally, for today, let's look at Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Paul writes, "Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time." Then verse 6. "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." Now, both Paul here and Peter will talk about knowing how you ought to answer people. And there's several implications other than these in Scripture that suggest to us that we ought to be prepared to give an answer, that we ought to be prepared to answer well. And so it implies maybe some training, some forethought, some planning. But notice the two things that he says in this passage about our speech. Our speech is to be gracious, and our speech is to be seasoned with salt. Now, it would be nice, I suppose, if both of these words in the original language were very unique words that had very specific meaning and illustration. But the reality is both of them are fairly broad and fairly common. You see, our speech ought to be gracious. It's the word charis. It's the word for grace. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Ephesians chapter 2. It is that word for grace, that simple word for grace. And in a deeply spiritual sense, we define grace as unmerited favor because we're talking about the grace we received from God. And I suppose in this context, unmerited favor wouldn't be a bad idea either, because maybe we should give people not only the benefit of the doubt, but give them kindness when they give us unkindness. Jesus sort of implies that that's how we ought to treat folks, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move into next week. But yes, there ought to be a favor, whether somebody deserves it or not. But basically he's saying, be gracious. Just be gracious in your speech. Be kind. Be gentle. Be good in your speech. And then he says, let your speech be seasoned with salt. Now, in reality, we talk about people talking in a salty way, and we're not talking about these things when we use that term in that way. We talk about something being spiced. Well, that's not what's being implied here. At least we would assume not. Seasoned with salt. Now, the idea here is simply salted. Having some salt put on it. Now, salt is not what we generally think of spicy or making something inflamed. No, it's making something palatable. There are so many things that we eat that we just really need a little bit of salt because it has very little flavor without the salt. The salt flavors it. The salt makes it edible. The salt makes it palatable. And there's a lot to be said about our words being heard, our words hitting the ear of the listener and being acceptable, being heard for what they were intended to be. And I think that's basically the idea here, is that our words should be gracious and our words should be palatable. Now, if you look at what we've suggested today by these few passages, the rules are fairly basic. The rules are, if you want life to be good, if you want to have good days and have a happy old age, then be careful what you say. Be cautious with your words. Use them well. Realize that our words come from our heart. So maybe we ought to stop excusing our words and change our heart so that the words change. And certainly the implication here is we will not change our words by trying to change our words. We will change our words by changing our heart. And then finally, the simplest recipe for what our words ought to be is that they ought to be gracious, they ought to be seasoned with salt. They ought to be favorable, they ought to be palatable to people. You know, in the reality, if the words we say are not heard as we intend them to be heard, then our words are really of no value. They're simply the utterings of our voice that don't matter or that have negative effects on the life of people. They're just chatter. They're just clatter, if in reality they don't land somewhere and mean something. As we move forward in our study over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking next week particularly about angry words. Certainly the biggest topic under our words and the words that we choose would be angry words or words that we should not say. And then we're going to be talking, one lesson is going to be entitled The Send Button. You know, we make so many choices about what we say and when we say it. And there are so many things that we say that we wish we hadn't said. There are so many things we say we would like to be able to take back. So that's going to be our topic over the next couple of weeks. And as we move from topic to topic, we'll try not to muddy up the next one too much. Thank you for joining me today. Hope that you'll enjoy this study, Words with Friends. For those of you who are going now into some Zoom meetings to discuss these studies just a little bit further, I wish for you a good discussion, some meaningful transactions. We hope you have a good day, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday.